Dr. M, if you'd like to introduce yourself, then we can get started.
Okay, well, I'm Norm Mooradian, and thank you for inviting me to present tonight, and thank you for attending. And so, what I'll be talking about is really, I guess, information ethics and how I got into it, and they're very closely related. So I want to talk a little bit about my career trajectory, because it's kind of illustrative of how your career kind of winds around in some ways, but prepares you for different roles. And so I can describe how, the steps I took and what I was doing and how I ended up, here at San Jose State teaching, information science, but with a real specialization in all things ethics. And then I'll talk a little bit about information ethics, what it is and how it relates to LIS and to your careers, and what it is as a kind of form of knowledge, so that you get a sense of the landscape. And then an important thing, the idea of AI ethics is really, information technology has really uh, changed since I started. It's really transformed in it, really a rapid pace and in just a short amount of time. These things have crystallized, and so that's changed the ethical landscape and really put ethics at the center of information technology in a way that hadn't been there before. So that's kind of the path, and then I'll point to some resources too, that you can take a look at. And for all you e-porters, this is going to be, pure comp A. So hopefully leave you some fodder for that essay and some references. So for my bio to start, so I've been teaching on the tenure track full time here for this is my second year, but I taught part time for 5 years while I was in industry. And so I started with a course in the MAR program on ethics based on the textbook I wrote, and I'll talk about that trajectory a little bit more. But right now I teach 202, so I'm doing two sections of 202 right now, and then I developed a course when I was still part-time on artificial intelligence and data and ethics, and that's developed into a 3-unit course, and I think this is the third semester I'm teaching it. So it's a relatively new course. And again, I can talk about the genesis of that. I am I had to develop a course for the informatics program that's been accepted, and I'm not teaching it this year, but probably next year. And then I'm also going to transition into being the academic advisor for the data science and information science bachelor's program. So that will be part of what I do starting in spring. So my background, in terms of work, I started in academia and philosophy. I'll talk about that in a second, but I ended up in the information industry. And so I was working through my own company, and then the last 10 years through a large global corporation in the field of content management, enterprise content management. And again, I'll say a little bit more about that. Then my research really falls into the bucket of digital ethics or information ethics, all the different kinds of topics associated with it, and knowledge management. That's another side of my interest as well. And so that is my kind of my current focus here in terms of research and teaching. So let me say a bit about my career, but before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about careers, because everybody here is in your career, and you're working in your career in your different places. And so one of the things I want to start off with is the idea that there are really two, to simplify, there are really two kinds of career trajectories. One is linear, where you kind of start, with an idea of what you want to do. You study that topic, and then you either do some post-secondary education, or you go right into your field, and then you do that, and then you retire from that field. And I know people have done that. But for most people, the career is nonlinear. You start somewhere and you go in another direction, or you go into this field, or you get that education. And so even though in retrospect it looks like a very coherent plan, it has a sort of nonlinear shape to it. And I think a lot of people's careers are like that. And I think even this program, we see a lot of people have come to find information library science at a certain point in their lives, some earlier, some later. And so there are, again, these two kinds of of trajectories. And mine definitely, I would say, falls into the nonlinear category. So to give you a picture of that, this is really at 10,000 feet. I won't go into all the details. I started off studying philosophy. That was my bachelor's degree. Like a lot of people in this program, I just was an avid reader. I love books. And I found philosophy was a great way to think rigorously about things using natural language, not getting bogged down with lots of symbols. And a great bridge to other fields as well. So that's what I started off with. And then after I graduated, I worked a little bit, but I was thinking about, well, what's next? I wanted to do graduate education. I thought about libraries. I thought about law. And then I think my friends convinced me to do the least practical thing, and I ended up going into a Ph.D. program in philosophy at Ohio State. But it's kind of ironic because in some ways, and this is like a theme of kind of my career points, I end up with law still being something of really I'm connected to. I did at some point do some work in a master's in law program. And so that's still connected. And of course, I'm working in the School of Library Science. So a lot of the things you really are interested in, they somehow are part of this orbit around you, even if you're focusing at one point. And so I taught philosophy. I actually started teaching philosophy in graduate school. So I was 24 and I started teaching at Ohio State. And then after I graduated, it took 6 years. I was teaching in local colleges, and then I got a job at the University of Puerto Rico to speak of Spanish. My Spanish was pretty sharp at that time. Now it's still there, but anyway, I taught philosophy there. And then, for familiar reasons, different things going on, I did leave academia, and I got into the information fields. So to date myself, when I got into the information fields, the new thing was client computing and network personal computers and the rise of the internet. So I kind of stumbled into a field called, at the time it was called document imaging, and it evolved to be document management and content management and enterprise content management in the cloud with workflow and databases and portals and all sorts of things like that. So it was something that really grew. And if you think of applications in terms of large scale databases, the field of content management is very much in the space of 202. The information retrieval systems, and it really is a vast universe because it's the unstructured data. So it was really, in some ways, a bit of luck that I got into a field that just grew so much. It grew in terms of the components of it and its range and scope and all the departments we were in and all the industries we were in. So that's something I did, and I did that for 2 decades. But one of the things I was doing is, because I came out of philosophy and I really approached the world with that academic foundation, I really started looking at ways to combine, my education and my interests and my intellectual tendencies, my kind of my inner self and motivation with the industry. And so I started looking at ways that, what I was doing was, connected with philosophy, or I could connect philosophy to it. And two things. I mean, there are a couple of things that were really quite salient. First, when you look at the two, like philosophy and computing, I think, well, what do they have to do with each other, right? But philosophy is very abstract and it's based in logic. And guess what? Computers are abstract and they're based in logic. Everything a computer does is based in logic. All the math, everything it does is just really based in Boolean logic. So I began to see real affinities, and I could see that there are areas that really map very closely. One was the question of knowledge. You look at computers and we look at knowledge organization, information management. That's all about knowledge. And so we think, okay, well, philosophy studies knowledge. There are fields like epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science. You can go on. And I thought, I'd start relating that to what I was doing. And also, of course, ethics is at the center of philosophy and political philosophy and normative theory. So I started developing those connections and studying these topics. And I ended up starting to write. I started publishing papers. I started teaching at Cal Poly a course in business ethics, which I did for 5 years, again, relating, my interest in ethics as a discipline with business practice and my experience in business with teaching. And so out of that came the idea of writing a book that was kind of really a book of professional ethics, little business ethics for people in the information fields. And so I started writing a book, and took me 5 years to do that because I was doing that, in my spare time, a lot of Saturdays. I published the book with the American Library Association. And that got me very connected with San Jose State because this was ended up being a textbook, and they put together a review committee, and one of the members was Pat Franks, who's emerita now and who ran the MARA program. So she invited me to teach the MARA program. One thing led to another, and then we get to this last box here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, and that's me here now. So that's sort of the high level picture. This spans a few decades, but more than a few. But the moral of the story, is again, your career trajectory can be kind of windy, but that doesn't mean it's not in a sense straight. It just means that it cuts a wider path, and it brings together different interests. And it's really, I think I've one of the things I found, and I kind of preach sometimes, is that the idea of having multiple interests and multiple domains of knowledge and finding ways of bringing them together, kind of like a Venn diagram where they intersect. I think that is actually, I think, a very powerful thing and something you should think about. And so if you change, like you're doing something and and then you change to another, don't discard what you previously did, because that is knowledge, and the two could come together in some form. And I think of all the different directions, the paths in LIS, I think in some ways the special libraries fits that paradigm best, because when you're in a special library, it's not just about having some of these fundamental skills, but it's about also understanding the content, I think, of that library and that field it represents. So I think it fits well with that. So that is the view over from 1,000 feet. So I'll turn to say a little bit about what the field is that I got into. It's kind of at the center of my work, although again I work a lot on knowledge issues and knowledge studies as well. But I want to talk a little bit about what information ethics is, how it relates to professional ethics, how it relates to LIS and to your education and to your profession, how it fits into your trajectory and how you fit into ethics as LIS professionals. So I'll start with the idea that really when you look at something like information ethics or professional ethics, and we think of the ALA's library ethics and their codes. These are really specialized domains of knowledge and specialized domains of ethics that fit within a larger framework. They fit within a common morality. So you think, okay, what's that common morality? Well, it's shared by all of us. We understand it. We understand its principles. It can be articulated in broad principles, and it guides us through our personal lives. And as human beings, we live within this framework, and we have obligations within this value system. But when we're in a professional field, we develop very specialized knowledge and deal with special problems. And by virtue of doing that, we end up looking at new realities. A lot of our fields are based in technologies that didn't exist, when our moral thinking was forming. So professional ethics usually reflects that specific specialized practice of a professional and the problems they face and the new realities that really kind of form the foundation of their profession. And so the common morality gives you the framework, but you really have to work out specific rules. And information ethics is much like that. Information ethics really reflects the growth of information technology and all the new realities and issues and practices that it created and continues to create. In fact, that's why I have AI ethics listed here. It's kind of a continuation based again on the changes to our information ecosystem and infrastructure based on these new capabilities, again, new problems that they create. So you can think of that. So when you think about yourself, think, okay, you're a human being, you have multiple roles, not just your professional role. As a human being, you have common moral knowledge and common moral obligations, but as professionals, you have specialized knowledge that gives you special responsibilities and also puts you in a position to face specific types of ethical problems where you have the expertise to work on them. And one more point about professional ethics. Again, as professionals, you have a code of ethics, the ALA code of ethics. You're going to write about it. When you do Comp A, I'm going to read probably some of it tonight when I look at the e-port. That professional ethics comes from your specialized knowledge, but also the trust that's put in you because of that knowledge, the autonomy you're given to do your work, the public service mission of a profession. That's one of the defining features of a profession, and your professional community, which is really what the ALA and the SLA really constitute. So that gives you, again, a certain new role, a certain professional role with, again, professional knowledge that includes ethical knowledge. And that's what this Venn diagram is meant to show, kind of that this takes place. These specialized areas really are articulations of a common framework based in specialized knowledge and the creation of new realities. And again, to give an example, people have always had a concern with privacy. Privacy differs across cultures. What people want to keep private differs across cultures. What people are mandated to keep private differs across cultures. But not too long ago, a thing called databases was created, then cloud computing and data analytics and machine learning, and there are just vast amounts of information and personal information sitting in the cloud. Everything we're doing is being tracked. That's a new reality, and you as information professionals are working in that context. So how do we adapt our values to that? And that's what information ethics is fundamentally about. So again, I'll say a few things about information ethics and then about the ethics of artificial intelligence. Again, give you that picture, and then look at some resources, and then we can go into questions about really anything. So information ethics has been around for, I'd say, quite a long time. Probably the field starts getting going in the 50s, but really gets its legs in the 80s and 90s. It's really concerned with the life cycle of information. It's really concerned with what is the fundamental focus of LIS, which is recorded information. Concerned with information, how it's used, how it's created, how it's disseminated, information through its entire life cycle. So you can see some of the issues here. These are not all the issues, but these are central issues that have been part of information ethics. There have been different titles for the field, and again, they've reflected the technological environment. So as the internet came into place, people talked about cyber ethics, they talked about internet ethics, people talked about IT ethics. Again, all these kind of point our interest to some particular aspects of the larger information world. But information ethics has been probably the most stable label, and I use it to describe this focus. As a field of academic study, it really is multidisciplinary, but in its first incarnation, it really was started in LIS. There was a journal called the Journal of Information Ethics. It was run by a person named Robert Hopman. I actually published a paper in it years ago when I was in industry and had correspondence with Bob. I didn't realize he was a founder of the field at the time, but really, the LIS profession started the teaching of it, but then became very, multidisciplinary, really from its inception, involving philosophy, computer science, and business management, just to name some of the central fields, and being close to the academic field of business ethics, which started before it. So it's had that kind of multi, disciplinary aspect to it. And then it's informed the development of law. So, many moons ago, we did not have a lot of information law. We still don't. Information privacy law, was more sectoral. And the HIPAA, for example, was a major law in the 1990s. And we're only seeing now comprehensive privacy law at the state level, but now it's really beginning to blossom. And so information ethics has been, kind of a foundational intellectual area for informing law and scholarship in law. And I would describe scholarship in law as also feeding into information ethics. ALA, professional ethics. Again, we were talking about professional ethics a second ago. There's a lot of overlap because as a profession, ALA is, of course, focused on the bibliographic universe and information. So I've laid out some of the pieces of the Code of Ethics updated in 2021. And you can see a lot of overlap in some of the topics. There's also some divergences, some things that are outside the scope of information ethics as I describe it, but picked up in other areas as well. So you can see again a lot of overlap. Other fields also have to be concerned about information, medical ethics, and so forth. But for people in libraries, SLA, ALA, information is at the heart of what they do. So there's a lot of overlap. And as of 2023, the ALA is revising its competencies, and ethics is really very, very prominent. There's a whole competency. There are 9 competencies, and there's one dedicated to social justice with many, sub-elements to it. But even within some of the other competencies, especially the one called gateway knowledge, which is the fundamental knowledge, you can see that it's really reprising all the points of information ethics, or all the points in the code. So you see that ethical knowledge is really taking a very fundamental role in the knowledge competence of the field. So that's information ethics. One last thing to say about it, though, is when I think about information ethics, I don't think about simply internalizing rules. I think about more understanding the rationale for any rule, being able to understand the values behind it, the rational considerations that form it, understanding based on that how to extend it, how to apply it to new cases, how to look at conflicting cases, because what happens quite often is many values or principles conflict. Privacy interests conflict, maybe with property rights or something like that. So information ethics is not just a matter of kind of internalizing some of these rules, but having the reflective and theoretical ability to reason from them and expand them, and both into particular situations or more broadly, when you're formulating policy. So that's information ethics. Now, as I mentioned, when I started working in industry, I think, the exciting things happening were object-oriented program, relational databases taking off, the internet, networking, Microsoft networks didn't exist. There was Lotus and Banyan Vines. I mean, some early networks. So all that was new. But, in the last number of years, we've seen radical changes with, artificial intelligence taking off. And this has had everything to do with big data. A lot of the techniques, even the deep learning techniques, which are so prominent today, really existed theoretically going back to at least the 70s. And so with big data, there's just been this massive revolution, and it's transforming obviously the information landscape, but along with it, it's transforming the ethics landscape. And so to denominate this, this area and these fields coming into existence, we use the word AI ethics, or the ethics of artificial intelligence, and that there's a vast body of literature being created, and very, very fast. It's being created by academicians, to go back to the composition of information ethics, it's multidisciplinary. It's computer scientists often presenting a more technical view. It's philosophers. It's sociologists, legal scholars. It's just a lot of different disciplines. A lot of people building a real vast literature on AI ethics, and that literature is both academic, but it's also exist as white papers and guidance documents of regulators. And so if you think about how information ethics and AI ethics relate, you can see AI ethics is just continuing this evolution as the information landscape develops. New realities and capabilities are being created, and they create new issues. And so there are two ways in which AI ethics really continues information ethics. One is that it magnifies previous issues. For example, take information privacy. That started as a problem in the 1970s, or an issue. But now with AI, it's magnified in two significant respects. One is that modern AI, machine learning, depends on big data. So you have to have massive amounts of data to run the analytics, the recommendation engines that recommend books to you and products. So modern AI sits on vast amounts of data and analyzes it. Secondly, modern AI can now make inferences that go beyond simple analytics and queries. There was a famous experiment in which some researchers in 2015 took Facebook likes and were able to, based on trained data, this is supervised machine learning, make inferences that were highly accurate about people's political affiliations or their sexual orientation, everything just based on Facebook likes. Things like liking H&M and curly fries and the Colbert Report, things like that. And so there's powerful inferences can be drawn. So one thing that AI has done is magnify existing problems. Second thing is it's created new questions. It's questions about, for example, bias in decision making. Machine learning depends on vast amounts of data, and so that data, if it contains biases, will then create what are called models, which are basically generalizations. They're used to make predictions or classifications. Identifies mathematically the relation of words to each other. So it creates a kind of semantic space, and it's used in large language models. And so deep learning is, this word embedding is very, very powerful and useful, but it contains biases based on the information it was trained on, which is really scraped from the internet, from social media. So, for example, a word like a word referring to a woman may bring up another word referring to housework. And whereas a word referring to a man might bring up computer programming, or you put in profession. So it starts making these associations that are part of this background language. Likewise, in job applications, when analyzing resumes, it can discriminate against women in favor of men, and the experiments have shown this happening. So this automation, this automated reasoning that AI ethics brings, has also brought new issues like bias, and then behind that, the difficulty of understanding what certain algorithms are doing. They call that algorithmic opacity. So the other side of AI ethics is that it creates a whole new set of issues, and then or issues, and now there's an attempt to understand how to address them, in both ethically and technically and through law. So I just list some of them here. I put a few in bold, not because they're more important, but because those are the things I'm spending most of my time researching right now. These are some of my areas. So when I look, and we talk about how I got into this, I was again looking at connections with philosophy, ethics, normative theory, political philosophy, or strong connection. I was working with traditional technologies like relational databases, content systems, networking. And as I've been doing that, technologies have been evolving at a rapid pace. And so I turn my interest to that. And that's kind of where I am now. Last slide, just for if you're looking for, again, some e-port fodder and information. My book's in the library. I use it in my classes as foundational. It really is a book in information and professional ethics. So it's you can get in there and easily download it or access information. For my class, I had the library get the Oxford Handbook of the Ethics of AI. There are a lot of really good books, but this is a very nice book, and it has lots of articles covering many different issues. So if you're interested in the ethics of AI, this is again something in the library. You can download articles that interest you. I teach a course. I'm going to teach it again next semester, the 287 course that covers really the topic of information ethics. SLA has a list of resources that really cover information ethics. They stop at about 2013, so it's not entirely updated. But again, information ethics has been evolving, so it's probably a pretty good guide for information ethics, the way I've defined it. So not a bad starting point. And of course, all of you will be citing professional codes and like the ALA code of ethics in the work you do and in your e-port. So that resource is also a good starting point. So that's it for my slides. I'm happy to talk about anything you'd like to talk about.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been very thorough. By the way, do you know if we could have access to the slides for people that want to see them afterwards?
Oh, sure. I sent them earlier, but I think I noticed some typo somewhere, so I'll send them again. I forgot which slide it was on, but I'll resend it. Yeah. Sure.
Cool. I guess a question I had would be, so I know, like you said, that you had some of the topics in bold, for example. Are those areas that you are concerned about, or is it like, or is there anything that you're concerned or optimistic about specifically looking forward or as you're researching right now?
All these issues are really important, and so the fact that I bolded some, and those are my main focuses, have to do more with the evolution of my work and thinking. So I started thinking about privacy a long time ago. A few years ago, I worked on privacy law and got a certification from the IAPP in privacy. And so privacy has been like an ongoing concern. And so as I look at AI, I'm interested in how privacy develops there. I'm also interested in looking at virtual reality and one issue that would be interesting to me would be the issue of privacy, and people have written about it. So it reflects the continuity of my interest in terms of research. Because of the effort it takes and the background knowledge you have to publish papers, it takes some time to build that. So that was one ongoing area. Automation employment, it really interests me because behind it is connection to human cognition. And so again, I'm connecting with philosophy, philosophy of mind, cognitive science. These are background disciplines I find very relevant to understanding what aspects of human thinking can be automated and what not. And years ago, I wrote a paper and published in a knowledge management journal about tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge has been a huge central topic in the field of knowledge management, although the concept arose as part of philosophy of science. And so those intersection of interests have been something I've been thinking about for a long time. I'm working on a book project called Knowledge Ethics and the Knowledge Economy with a group of people and a thought leader in the knowledge management field. And so again, this is connected. So this really has to do with some background interests, and then my background in industry. You know, we used to build systems that automated things. We were, you know, building enterprise content management with automation of various sorts. Now AI is becoming part of that space. And our company was looking at we were working with a major RPA vendor. RPA is robotic process automation, which automates a lot of tasks. So again, this connects with my background working with systems. So basically, I'm trying to work with the different intersecting knowledge areas I have, and likewise with AI governance. You know, in industry. Again, connecting my interest in ethics with my practice in industry, we built systems for records management and the management of public records and public disclosure of public records. And so governance was a huge interest for me over again the last 20 years. Again, started with records management, but then the concept of information governance started developing, and so. Now we're looking at how, you know, at AI governance, and I'm working with a project called Interpares. They have an AI project called Trust AI, and I'm on a working group thinking about some information governance issues. So these is really there's continuity with my past work, and then just limitations on what else I can work on. And this is in the area of AI ethics. My other interest is in knowledge management, and so again, I'm focusing a lot on those issues having to do with knowledge in human brains and knowledge in computers, and what's the gap between them, because that goes back again to the philosophy of mind, which is a central topic in philosophy.
As like my background is copywriting, so so it's been interesting to me as a freelancer to see people looking to hire people for very little money, hoping that they will fill their AI bots or whatever with writing and stuff, and so that the bots will obviously write for them. And on top of obviously all of the there's a lot of obviously discussions going on about ChatGPT on top of all of the other different resources that we have available to us. And or for example, when I interview somebody, on the other side of things, I will, if it's a written interview, I will use otter.ai, which is a transcription service. And when you think of, as somebody who's not a philosopher or whatever, if you think of transcription is just a lot of work. It's just copying words versus putting that discussion into an essay or into an article is a different type of thinking, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
when other people have found papers or online magazines that now appear to be just AI generated, because some of it does not make a lot of sense. And so it's just interesting to see what is successful, what is maybe not so successful, and those different kinds of debates that people are having about paying people for what and that sort of thing right now.
Yeah, no, and again, all these issues are really powerful issues, and they require, real dedication of time. So, in my text, I talk about copyright and some of its underlying rationales or intellectual property, and the justification for it and its purposes. To give a kind of background to think about it, and so anyone in LIS can have a real appreciation of the nuances of copyright, right? So you bring that expertise to that topic, and I don't know, copyright was kind of a sleepy issue in my view for a long time. It was really more about entertainment. There was a copyright case about whether the riff from Stairway to Heaven was a violation of copyright. That's where the real hard cases were. And behind me I have a whole thing of copyright law that deals with that kind of thing. But AI has really changed the game very quickly. And the thing that's done is these large language models, more than anything, a rules-based approach to generating text was very not working, but these language models, which essentially predict the next word based on the word before it and just builds that up. It's just purely statistical. They have really created this possibility for people to generate text that can pass for certain purposes. And it really is an interesting question it raises interesting questions about copyright. The first question was, can you accord copyright to an AI system itself? And courts have ruled against that because, generally speaking, only human beings can be accorded a copyright, or non-natural persons, meaning corporations. But the corporations are really fictions that represent human beings, right? So, first of all, when you think about ethics at this deeper level, you start asking, well, why is that the case? And the underlying rationales about copyright connect with human values and human flourishing. But anyway, that's been like kind of the first thing. But the larger and harder question is that suppose that a large language model trains on the published work of many, many people. And like, for example, in medical science using PubMed, which is a large database of articles. Okay, it's not citing those people, it's taking their information and it's codifying it. It's doing it statistically, but it's sweeping it all up. What question does that raise about the distributive justice behind intellectual goods that we create as a society? That the copyright is fundamentally about that. It's about all the things that libraries are about, this recorded human knowledge and the rights of access and the benefits and burdens of creating it. How do we properly acknowledge that as a society, and how do we keep this production going? ChatGPT raises real questions about that. And it's not at the level of certain things, but it's at the level of, basic writing. I asked ChatGPT once to write a poem about wedding anniversaries in the style of Dylan Thomas, because he wrote a poem that's just a perfect poem. And what it gave me was a Hallmark thing. Again, from an automation perspective, there are not that many jobs for top poets. Maybe there are 5 really good poets in a language at a time, right? So, but for writing correspondence, even writing basic code, does it. But where's it getting this knowledge? So that connects with the issue of automation too, and all these issues too connect. They're not just separate. It's just there's this particular angle. So copyright's become a huge intellectually interesting question, because it may not be a suitable concept for what ChatGPT is doing, and that's where we go to ethics. What is owed to people who write and put things out on the internet for whatever reason? And it goes to the question of the distribution of goods in a society and burdens. The people who can build large language models are named Google, Microsoft. You can count, there are about probably 10 companies that can do it, because it takes hundreds of millions of dollars to do it. Now, there's a possibility that the investments are not going to pan out because of the limitations that could be hit. But these large language models cost a lot of money, and they also put a burden on the environment that people don't realize. So there's a movement to try to build smaller, smaller models. But so to go back to your point, copyright's a really important issue, and some of this changes based on the technological capabilities. Copyright wasn't foremost on my mind a year ago, but now it's a big issue.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Lauren. I have a question, Dr. Mooradian, about AI-generated content, as you have described, because there are lots of ethical considerations when using AI to generate content, such as automated news articles or metadata, as you have mentioned. What do you think about the future landscape about information ethics, and how it's going to evolve in terms of new job openings in this field? Are we going to have new titles that we're going to hear soon that we are not aware yet?
So definitely there'll be new titles we're not aware of. So when I was in college, I used to write my papers with a manual typewriter, and the personal computer was, so the whole field I got into didn't exist when I was in college. And that's happening at a faster rate. So it's changing constantly. That's why it's very important, I think, always get fundamental skills, thinking skills, because the technologies change very quickly. So definitely new titles will be created. So it kind of to take the narrow view first of your question and the broader view, you can already see there are positions now arising with the title, like AI ethicist. Salesforce has some position. There's a person named Kathy Baxter there who has kind of led that effort, and they have a team. Google had an ethics team, and Timnit Gebru was part of that. She's a really famous computer scientist and activist. She was fired for kind of opposing some of some of their policies. But some of these big companies, Microsoft, have had whole departments devoted to this and embedding people with a kind of ethics role into project teams, project development teams. So this is already happening, with some of these companies. Now there's debate as to whether this is what's called ethics washing or public relations. It could be more that companies are not monolithic in their thinking. When people do kind of butt heads and have different perspectives. So there are positions being created in these larger companies. The other thing is, I mentioned the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals. It's mainly attorneys are part of that, but other people interested in privacy law. I could see last couple years that they were sort of moving into the AI space. So from a law practice perspective, law has always been kind of at the center of information ethics in organizations. So legal positions are moving in that direction. And of course, as legal scholars like Daniel Solov argue, law schools haven't really caught up with privacy yet, but the field is moving toward that. So that's another area. So you can expect to see more of that, like actual positions. But what's more likely is that from an ethics, like as a role, like an ethics role, it's going to be part of or embedded in other roles, especially information professional roles. Like if you think of records management, so much of what records management does is going to be automatable. We can already automate disposition of documents, and I was building systems, configuring systems, they're already built that did that just on rules base. So think about all the kind of routine aspects of a job that are going to be replaced in records management. That would be one of them. So what would records management do? It needs to move into governance and think about those normative issues. So to go to your question, the new titles will arise, but more than anything, old titles will morph a bit, and they'll include this as an area of knowledge. It'll be maybe a specialization, and it may not have a title that makes it totally explicit, but that's kind of where things are going. And it's a great role for people in LIS, because the LIS practice is so rooted in values, in social justice and other things like that. And so yeah, I think you'll see this will be part of modern work, as will the ability to work with AI technologies. Just about every job will be touched by it. Will be,
Thank you.
I see Emily has her hand up.
Yes, I do. Thank you. One thing that I have been considering a lot, it's been actually coming up in my work. I don't work in a library. I work for a state agency for the state of California, for the California Arts Council, is the issues around privacy and AI with the issue of opting out. So concerns with AI has come up a couple, and I'm very interested in AI anyway, so I was excited that it came up at work. So for example, today, there was, we do a lot of our internal, and we're starting to do a lot more of our external meetings virtually. And there was one of my coworkers was concerned about the and it's been fact checked that they're not doing this. Like, for example, Zoom using faces and voices to educate their AI. I have, for example, an arts organization that is coordinating a large project with multiple artists. And they did a lot of research to find a place where all the artists could put their work where it wouldn't be scrubbed by AI. So when I think about we're using because I would love to use an AI tool to do meeting notes, to do transcriptions, to do these public meetings. The thing that I'm wrestling with is how we can stay ethical and give people the options to opt out while still using these tools.
That's a great question, and there are so many things to say. The first thing to say too is that, I was talking about information ethics and LIS. The ALA and the SLA the ALA more I think focuses on libraries and what happens in libraries. But in my career, I worked, as I said, information technology, and in my area of specialization was really government agencies. So I worked with lots and lots of municipalities in California and then some adjacent states. But that was sort of so I worked a lot with them and these kinds of systems. So the first thing to think about is that, as LIS professionals, whether you're in libraries or not, most of the ethical issues are happening outside of it. They're happening across the information, ecosystem, and they're moving fast. And so your expertise is going to be needed to address not just things happening in libraries, but in any business organization, state, whether it's a public or a private organization. Shaping policy is going to be very important. And so the real difficulty is that we very quickly moved to cloud-based systems. So San Jose State uses Google, right? Our email is Google, or we use Google Drives. We use Zoom. Zoom announced in a kind of blog or news release that was going to change its policy so that it would use recorded meetings to train its machine learning, right? Then they backed off of that, but they just backed off, so they may get back to doing that. And what kind of issues does it raise? It raises privacy issues insofar as that it's really ingesting all this information and codifying it. So it's not that it has all the data ingested, but it begins to have representations of them. And people have found that they can get personal information out of ChatGPT through very skillful prompting. But it also goes back to the question of intellectual property rights. You're having a meeting, you're discussing some kind of practices, you're discussing writing a book, and all that stuff could be ingested. So the question is, what do we do? And the answer is, I really think that this has to be addressed at a policy level. There have to be requirements for how technology is developed, what's permitted, what's not permitted, what these things can be used for. It's very hard for an individual to address on a personal level. Again, when I look at privacy issues, how do I address it as a personal issue? Do I fiddle with privacy settings on my browser? That's just such a inconsequential thing. It has no effect. So it really has to be at a policy level. The state of California passed major legislation modeled on the GDPR. It's actually had 2 rounds of it, and that's the kind of thing that will really drive things. Like there are kind of concepts of a right to be forgotten. Language models have trouble forgetting, right? And so we're going to have to really, as a profession, advocate for those kinds of things. Where you find abilities, to not participate, you can take them, but it's very hard to step out of our information structure. We depend on the cloud. Most applications are cloud-based, and the vendors who have those cloud-based applications have as a strategy using the data to improve their processes. So we have to define what are ethical ways of doing it. methods of eliminating private information, anonymizing it. There are various kinds of things that computer scientists are talking about to try to minimize some of these privacy risks. But we're going to have to mandate some of those things, and I think intellectual property is going to be a big part of it. And some of the responses too at the societal level will be considering how to shift the burdens and benefits, because again, maybe it's beneficial for us to have large language models, but then what does it mean when a few companies own it and they got it free from from all these knowledgeable people who contributed text? Is there a way of somehow changing that balance of benefit and burden? So I don't know if that doesn't answer your question. I'm saying there's not too much you can do except to try to change the fundamental structure of these companies. And in the United States, it's much harder right now. In Europe, they actually have a passed legislation called the AI Act, which is similar in its scope and power to the GDPR, and so it will influence the world globally. But that's the kind of legislation that starts shaping what organizations can and cannot do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mooradian. Kay has a question on the chat. You mentioned that when you were in college, you were studying about a field that wasn't exactly established yet. When we are done with our program, the technology we learned about used might not be as relevant. Can you recommend how we can remain aware of the issues you suggested, you discussed, like technology, AI, ethics?
So, think of your education as a foundation, and so what's the first thing that you should do after you graduate? Go out, have a drink. But the next thing is to go get a book and keep on learning. It's really the whole purpose of education is to position you for lifelong learning. So you want to continuously be involved in learning, and again following the things that interest you. There are a lot of ways of picking up specific technical knowledge. Like say you want to learn a particular language, you can take any kind of class. You can get a book. You want to learn SQL, you can go grab a text on it and start playing with a database. So there'll be all these different technical skills you can learn, and you'll learn along the way as these things come up and are invented. There'll be so many of them, though. Piece of advice: try not to do everything, because it can actually be very unsettling to try to keep up with every development. You have to kind of choose the things that are relevant to your work. So I think really when you're in a program like this, I would ask yourself, like, what classes give you fundamental knowledge? What classes give you thinking skills? And when I was in college, I wasn't studying for a field that didn't exist. I didn't know it existed. I was studying Plato, but we were also studying mathematical logic. And, fundamentally logic and inquiries into the nature of knowledge helped give me a conceptual basis for thinking about other things. So try to think about things that are giving you some kind of foundation to absorb new information, to analyze it, to understand what things you might need to learn. You could create kind of an architecture of your own mind, so that it's positioned to pick up new things as they come along, but more than anything, put them in the right context, because there's this real drive to automate things. So look at it this way too: there's a real drive to automate tasks. So don't be a task person, don't be a process person, be a strategic person who thinks about how processes and tasks fit together.
Okay, my question is more like, this is Kay. I was the one that posted that question. My question is more like recommendations for like a site for articles, like, I don't know, CNET, but that's like more computer, so I don't know if that really applies. So that's why I'm asking in general.
For research references.
Yeah,
And that's for
just to be aware before I decide and dive into it. But before I don't want to just pick up a book and learn about SQL, when I just want to learn just little articles, little bits of information first before I make a decision.
Yeah, so there's so many different sites. So like for technical knowledge, you're talking about. So things like LinkedIn Learning, which every student here has access to free, are places to go for kind of practical guys. There are various presses like O'Reilly, which is a good source for some of these practical kind of just text to look at. I would do, like, if you do a search on MLK, I've done a lot of these searches to find resources for my classes, but you do a search on any one of these topics, like say you thought, oh, I'm really excited about AI, I'd like to do some programming. Do a search on AI programming, and textbooks on AI and Python programming with AI come up. So you can find a lot of these how to do it texts you can take a look at. For single articles, kind of how to, I'm not too sure. Apart from, I think things like LinkedIn Learning give you a nice basic introduction, very nice, the very basics.
It's not so much as how to, it's more like just general information, like articles, AP News, CNET. I can't think of any right now. AP News, I know that's not it, but I'm just giving examples of sources with little bits of articles, not textbooks, not how to text. Not yet. It's just articles.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like non-technical sources. Often, so when I was getting out of graduate school and deciding I was going to go to get into the technology field, I started taking some classes and things like what was called Visual Basic at the time. Now it's called .NET. But I would also find I've had a kind of approach too, where I'll find a kind of general text that talks about things. Like, I might have a title like Technology and Society, or some kind of more recent book or anthology that gives kind of an overview of different fields and different areas. That's often a good place to start, because there's so many like you can search for articles in the library. ResearchGate is a nice source of things, but a lot of them tend to be very academic, and they may be very theoretical. They may not even be how to, they may be very theoretical. But sometimes finding a good introductory text that talks about technology and society, technical developments, it gives you a nice survey. So I might start with more of like a book, because then it unifies the different articles and it also gives you a nice bibliography. That's probably the way I would approach it. So kind of the best I can do with that question, because it's a great question, and it's not an entirely easy thing. In fact, I've spent a lot of time trying to find resources in AI for my students that are not too technical, but not too simplified, and it's a kind of a difficult spot. But I would start with something like that, kind of a survey book that looks at new emergent technologies and gives a sense of some of the developments, especially looking forward. So I hope that helps. I don't have great ideas on that.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, very helpful. Thank you.
We have another question on the chat from Julie, and this is a bit step back, but how did you arrive at that intersection of tech and philosophy? Or in general, do you have any tips of trying to marry your interests together to find that sweet spot?
Yeah, so to start,
thanks for this discussion.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so when I was in graduate school, in philosophy, they have a curriculum which covers a lot of different areas: political philosophy, logic, philosophy of science, ethics. I ended up writing my dissertation on the late dialogues of Plato. So I was actually more of a classicist, and that's kind of connection with archives. I mean, I had classical Greek, and so then I found myself moving out of academia, moving out of that role. And I was already interested in ethics and even thinking I wanted to do more of that. So I found myself in business, kind of went through a process that Kay's question was about. Like, I was educating myself on technology. And then I started thinking, okay, well, here's where I am now. what do I know that's helpful? What do I want to carry forward? And so I started looking at those things like to carry forward. So that's why I started thinking about ethics. I first started thinking, well, ethics is something that just is worth knowing anyway. And then I started realizing that, well, there's a field of business ethics. And so I started studying that, and then information ethics. So the question of how to marry things is to, in some ways, kind of do an inventory of what your experiences are and what you know. And as you're moving into different things, think about, okay, well, I'm in this field right now. What is it that I find interesting in this field? Is there anything in this field that connects with something I did in the past, whether it's a particular kind of knowledge or a particular kind of activity? So start trying to look at potential connections, and then you can engage, as we talked about earlier, self-study. You continually learn. Think about the self-study that bridges that gap. But it's a kind of self-reflection about what's important to you in whatever field you're in, and how that connects with things you know and things you want to know. And you start kind of crafting that unique knowledge. And I think it's really important to have unique knowledge, because anything that's very common and procedural, well, guess where it's going to be? ChatGPT, right? Anything that's statistically prevalent will be represented in a large language model. So you have to be thinking about your own unique perspective on the world and giving it some value. I think that's the message I want to give. Value that uniqueness, because that's the one thing that will survive AI. And but it takes time to kind of evolve it. But it's your own process. I hope that answers. It's kind of hard to generalize, but.
Thank you, Dr. Mooradian. Julie says thank you. That is very helpful. So I have a question about cultural and societal norms, and how do cultural and societal norms impact information ethics, and how do you think should professionals navigate differences when it comes to serving different communities?
It's a great question, and when I talk about ethics as a framework, these frameworks tend to be very general. And so we have an international human rights framework, and it gives us a way of thinking about the most fundamental things that we have in common, right? Nobody likes to be without food or shelter. So we start with some fundamentals, and that's our common morality. When you look at something like information privacy, it's a common value we have. Everyone wants privacy, but for different things. And it's valued for different reasons in different societies. So within a framework, you have to look at how local norms fit into that framework, because local norms reflect people's values. And even within a country, there are differences. So it's part of your ethical thinking to understand, okay, what's the rationale for privacy? Psychological well-being, personal autonomy, financial security, all these different things that violations of privacy can affect, being able to access fundamental goods. Then you have to ask, well, okay, how do these things pertain to a particular situation, and what are some of the limits? So, for example, a system may be built in a Western society that presupposes certain things, uses biometrics, fingerprints to identify people, which is a privacy risk, but a way of identifying people. Such a system was used in India in order to provide state benefits without an ability to opt out. Create a lot of problems because of people's inability to identify themselves. There are a lot of people who worked whose fingerprints were not scannable because of the work they've done with their hands. And so they're being excluded from fundamental benefits. So you have to look at really the practical realities of every situation and factor in the values and the particularities of a situation. From a research perspective, in some ways, I think that this cultural competence is understudied. The European Union is a leading force in defining AI ethics globally. Various countries are developing frameworks, but they tend to be, again, very general policies. And so I think there's a lot of room for studying cultural variation in information ethics. in AI ethics, and there is some writing about the global South and these issues, and I try to cover it in my class, but I think it's an area that needs further development. And some people have written books like, information ethics from a Buddhist perspective, and there's a global ethics effort too to understand the theoretical study of ethics taking into account cultural difference. So there's stuff there, but it's understudied as an academic discipline.
Thank you, Dr. Mooradian. That's true. That's working on a global scale. This is a huge topic, information ethics with an international perspective. What do you think about why it is understudied? Is there a particular reason?
I don't know. I think when you look at the way things have developed, they've happened so fast. And so a lot of these technologies have first been deployed in the US and Europe. I mean, a lot of the companies are down the street from where a lot of you live, Google and Facebook. And so they've arisen so quickly in societies that migrated to the cloud. So in the United States now, so much of our work is really not just dependent on computers, but dependent on the cloud, that I think that formulation, the technology entities are from these countries, are from the United States, increasingly China. Those are the two global powers in AI right now. And so the reaction has also been to the context in which those powers are situated. So part of the problem is not only are those technology companies dominant within their societies and creating risks of monopoly, they're exporting the technology to other countries, which with different cultures, and even exporting the cultures that they presuppose. So, Google is a kind of a subculture of this country, representing a kind of elite point of view. But then now you're exporting it to another country. So I think that it's almost a question of catching up with that. There is research, there are people writing about it, but I think it really represents a next phase, especially as the technologies infiltrate other societies and become part of their infrastructure. That makes sense?
Thank you, Dr. Mooradian.
Yeah. And again, going back to my research interest, a reflection of what I already know. So it's also a limitation of people doing research. So someone like yourself with a more multicultural background, you can span different cultures. That's an invitation for you to look at, because it takes a foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I imagine it will continue to evolve with I was even just thinking with disability studies, or with other people who need different kinds of aids for different reasons, like having the ability to use transcription on the one hand could be good. You also wouldn't want a computer making up stuff for somebody that can't that it hasn't fully fleshed out a thought as well, when is it benefiting somebody versus when is it thinking for them to a degree. I don't know. Maybe that's beyond.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think the structure I envision for ethics is really, we have these fundamental principles, and then we start articulating these more domain specific rules about privacy, for example, rules about the use of automation, but they're situated in places, to Rocin's point, a Western workplace, for example. And then you start thinking about what about particular situations, and this could include disabilities, and how technology, the balance of benefit and harm can be different, and the specific benefits and harms can be different. And while ethics is about principles and reasoning, ultimately all ethical thinking has to involve a real investigation of the factual basis. That's why skills in information science are fundamental for understanding the ethics of information technology, because you have to understand something about that environment. So there are going to be so many issues that arise, and from an intellectual or academic perspective, you'll want to combine different fields. So what's been the thinking about rights within a certain domain for a certain population, and how does that now connect with thinking about information ethics and rights within the context of information? Have to piece this together. It's a big puzzle where you're getting at finer levels of resolution. You start with kind of this level of abstraction, but then you have to go down even further to particularities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. I guess the last thing I was thinking was like, what would you recommend to somebody who wants to go into the other side of what you were discussing earlier, like knowledge management, or do you think that's going to continue to evolve, I imagine, in the next few years, or I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I think that's a field that continues to develop a literature, and it's one of those things where, to go back to this question of titles and names, sometimes a name is very, very salient or explicit, and a position has a certain title to it. Other times it's a little bit implicit or buried, but understanding, how knowledge is represented by computers, how human knowledge and computers interact, how human brains interact with computers, how to organize knowledge, how to organize knowledge, people who have knowledge, how to preserve it and capture. Those are all still fundamental issues that are drawing research, and the field of knowledge management really is looking at the organizational context with some concerns about organizational performance, but the skills in LIS connect with it. So I think thinking about the nature of knowledge and how LIS intersects with it is a worthwhile thing to think about, because you're thinking about some of the fundamental questions of the field of LIS when you do that.
Well,
I have a question about ethics in collection development. I'm taking the digital asset management class and the digital curation class this semester, so that's why I'm interested in this. And I was wondering, when building a digital collection, what kind of ethical principles should guide the selection of the materials, the curation of the materials?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really goes back to this idea that within professional ethics, your specialized knowledge and the particular task raise specific types of questions. So some of the ethics of archives, or the SAA has produced guidance and books, and there's been some nice books produced on that. And you can kind of, again, look at different levels of resolution. There are concepts having to do with what's called conflict of interest, and how personal interest can interfere with your duties as a professional within the context of your practice. What conflicts of interest differs across professions and roles with responsibility. In a legal context, it would have to do with whether you have interest in the outcome of a legal proceeding, right? That's why people have to recuse themselves. So in archives, there are questions about your relation to the collection. Are you an historian, and are you biased toward bringing in materials that would help you? Or do you have practices would limit the access to some people in a way that's unfair? When you look at the mission, are you hewing to the mission? And if not, is it, again, because of a conflict of interest, or is it because of desire to advance your collection and get some notoriety? Like maybe something really kind of interesting to the public comes out, but it's not really within the mission of your collection. So a lot of your ethics is going to be very closely related to practice, and you learn a lot about practice by thinking about the ethics of the practice as well. So again, it depends on the kind of collection, but there are some things that are very specific to to say archives or building a library that would not be, you know, something you'd see in an organization, like, again, concerns about access, concerns about impartiality and collecting materials, making sure different perspectives are represented and that kind of thing. Some of the same considerations that go into subject indexing and the way in which some populations are privileged over others would be also relevant to the actual forming of a collection.
Thank you very much for that. I really like the idea of being impartial about when it comes to cataloging, for example, you want to be impartial about how you catalog the manuscripts.
Yeah, it's again, I tend to approach things in a kind of systematic top-down way, but I look at professions and their ethics across the board, and impartiality is like a fundamental requirement of professionals. And why is that the case? Well, because what the professional brings is professional judgment, right? They bring their expertise to decide matters of importance to people, and doctors and lawyers, for example, are deciding matters of real importance, and so are other professions. And so the idea that personal considerations or biases can get in the way of exercising your professional judgment impartially is really at the core of professional duty, and then on the other side of it, professional negligence. So it's a very important aspect. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't think about rectifying things. You know, suppose a collection is missing things from a particular perspective or population. Impartiality doesn't mean that you don't try to rectify that, and maybe you have to procure materials for a period of time that come from a less represented voice. So when sometimes there's discomfort about the idea of impartiality or neutrality because it suggests sometimes leaving injustices in place. But impartiality is more about using your judgment in a way that's not favoring your position, right? And in the arrangements of society fundamentally, and then in these specific situations. So you might come to the impartial judgment that you have to change collection practices because your collection practices have been biased, right?
Thank you. This is great. Thank you very much, Dr. Mooradian, for all your answers, all the clarifications, and thank you very much, everyone, for your questions.
Yeah, I was just
thank you.
Yeah,
well, thanks for inviting me.
This was really helpful, and yeah, I know anybody who's doing ePort is probably like, oh, thank goodness. Like I was working on my other competencies, and I was like, well, I know this one's coming up, so maybe I'll do them in a different order and come back today.
Good. Yeah, I know. Some of these sources here, the SLASM articles, my book is getting kind of a primer in it, in this, so those are available in the library. So I would definitely use some of those sources on professional ethics, ALA ethics. The ALA has a lot of guidance, in its professional documents on things like conflict of interest we were talking about, and intellectual freedom and some of its things. So I definitely would use those in developing your ePort.
Yeah, awesome. Really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks again for spending this time.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm sure we'll be talking soon about something.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for all the resources you have shared with us tonight.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Okay, well, thanks so much. Have a good night. And, talk to you soon.
Okay. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you very much,
Good night.
Dr. Mooradian.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Good night.
Bye.